You know, for centuries, there's been this one prophecy that's really puzzled theologians, the promise that the prophet Elijah would return before some great and terrible day. But what if that return isn't what anyone expected? Today, we're going to dig into a really unique interpretation that sees this prophecy not as a single event, but as a repeating pattern woven right through history itself.
All right, so here's the plan. First, we're going to look at the mysterious prophecy that kicked this whole thing off. Then, we'll get into this core concept of shadows and realities. And that's really the key to unlocking this whole theory. From there, we'll find out who the real Elijah is, according to this view. Check out the striking parallels they use as proof, and finally, see what this all might mean for the future.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning, with the prophecy itself. To really get what this author is saying, we've got to go back to the source, those ancient words from the prophet Malachi that set this centuries-long mystery in motion.
So this was actually the very last message the prophet Malachi gave to ancient Israel. It promised that the famous prophet Elijah would literally return to help heal relationships and get people ready right before a time of really severe worldwide testing. And that one single promise created an expectation that has lasted for millennia.
All right, now this is where it gets really interesting. To unlock this whole interpretation of Elijah's return, we have to talk about a key concept, this idea of types and antitypes. The author's whole argument is that a lot of things in the past weren't the real thing. They were just, well, types or shadows. Think of them like small-scale previews for something much, much bigger down the road.
So what does that actually look like? Well, let's take John the Baptist as a perfect example. According to this view, his work was the type, the shadow. It was kind of a partial fulfillment, right? It was aimed at just the single nation of Israel. But, and this is the key part, it was pointing towards something way bigger, the antitype or the reality, the real, complete fulfillment of the prophecy on a global scale. Okay, so if John the Baptist was only the shadow, that begs the question, right? Who, or maybe what, is the ultimate reality? Well, this brings us to the absolute core argument of our source material.
And here it is. The central claim is that the true, anti-typical Elijah, it isn't a single person coming back to earth. Instead, it's a collective body, the entire true Christian church, with Christ as its head and his followers as the body, operating throughout the whole gospel age.
And the mission of this collective Elijah is fascinating because it's kind of defined by a built-in paradox. While its job involved preaching and pointing out error, the author claims it was never actually meant to convert the entire world. In that sense, it was a foreseen failure. The real success, according to this view, was all about developing and testing the church itself, that choice little flock of saints standing against the tide.
I know, that is a really bold claim. So you're probably asking, okay, where's the proof? Well, the author builds their case on a whole series of what they call striking parallels, a prophetic pattern that connects the life of the original Elijah to the history of the church itself.
And this table here illustrates the method perfectly. Just look at these comparisons. Elijah was persecuted by Queen Jezebel, the anti-type. The church was persecuted by what the author calls the apostate church of Rome. Elijah fled into the wilderness for 3.5 years when there was a famine. The church fled into a symbolic wilderness for 1,260 years when there was a spiritual famine. The author presents this as absolutely not a coincidence, but a deliberate, prophetic pattern.
So for the author, these parallels aren't just historical curiosities. Not at all. They're presented as confirmation, direct evidence that a specific prophetic timeline is unfolding, and that, in their words, the time is at hand.
And that brings us to the final part of the argument, because this whole interpretation isn't just about explaining the past, it's used to prophesy the future, specifically, a coming period of major trouble, which is then followed by a global restoration.
The author sees our current era as a time of relative freedom, a day for spreading their message. But they use this quote to warn that a night is coming, a much darker time when that very work is going to become difficult, if not impossible.
This night is described as a time of persecution. The source predicts that religious and civil powers will team up and use coercive measures to silence anyone who's pointing out this interpretation of God's plan. And they draw a direct parallel to John the Baptist being thrown in prison for speaking out against the rulers of his day.
But the prophetic pattern doesn't stop there. Just as Elijah was succeeded by the prophet Elisha, the author argues the Elijah class will be followed by an Elisha class. This is a successor group, one that sympathizes with the first, but whose main work is prophesied to begin only after the Elijah class has completed its mission.
And just like with Elijah,
Elisha's life is seen as another prophetic blueprint. His miracles, like healing poisoned waters or raising someone from the dead, are interpreted as foreshadowing the huge restoration work this successor class is destined to perform for the world, cleansing truth from error and restoring all of mankind.
So, when you boil it all down, this whole interpretation hangs on one core idea, that prophecy isn't a single event, but a repeating pattern of types and antitypes. And it leaves us with a fascinating question to chew on, doesn't it? What does it mean to view history not as a straight line moving forward, but as a series of echoes, with each one revealing just a little more than the last?